Do you put it in? Are they already here?
Yeah, I started.
I mean, are they?
Let's wait for the people to.
So when I see that, I'll see them.
Yeah, they see it.
I was just before, but I have to.
I know for me.
Oh, really?
Oh. You know what I mean? Oh, got it.
That's all I
Yeah.
And that's how I thought.
That's always that's the biggest street.
It's also like 20 years.
Yeah, I know.
I like breaking the ice. You'll be asked to be there.
Yeah, one of the right, it's always so sweet.
No, no, I wanted to say
I'd
hi.
be surprised.
Hi, my name is Kristen. I'm from
Oh, good, very nice. I'm thinking-
That's kind of a really weird case.
Oh, he
Okay.
asked me.
Great.
I took 3 classes.
Oh, no, I-
What? I took 3 classes with you, so I know this.
I was even Charlie for the honeymoon.
You never took airline economics?
Yeah.
How long are you here?
I can never remember who took what.
I remember you asked the question on the final. That was, and I argued.
Are you gonna go, are you gonna stay straight?
Yeah.
Should we get started?
Expensive to the.
Okay, if we can get started, it's my great pleasure today to introduce distinguished Professor Jan Brueckner. Jan has started his career, or didn't, started at Champaign?
Yeah.
Yeah, he spent many years in the lovely town of Champaign-Urbana, during which he was also, most of that time, he was also the editor of the Journal of Urban Economics, which for those of you who aren't aware is the leading journal in a big subfield. And Jan was one of the few people in economics as an editor who actually got papers turned around in something under a year, for which many of us are grateful. He's done a massive amount of work in all areas of urban economics. In terms of transportation, most of his work lately has been with airlines. And I believe that's what he's going to be talking to us about today.
Great, thank you. So I've been at UCI 20 years in January. And so I figured it would be time to present a ITS seminar. And most of my transportation work is probably out of the realm of interest of ITS people, but I thought this topic might be of interest because it's sort of related to a vehicle policy, as I'll explain in a minute. So the paper is co-authored with Matt Kahn at USC and Jerry Nicholsberg at UCLA. And it's about cash-for-clunkers in the airline industry. So to start, let me say that aviation accounts for about 2 to 3% of global emissions and 8% of the emissions from transportation. And aside from subsidies that the U.S. government provides to research on production of sustainable aviation fuels, that's basically biofuels, there's really no government policy directed toward improving carbon emissions from the industry. And so what this paper does is to suggest a possible policy that may work and seems to be feasible based on our investigations. And so that policy is a cash-for-clunkers policy, and it's based on the automobile cash-for-clunkers program that operated in 2009. during the Great Recession, or the beginning of the Great Recession. And what the Cash-for-Clunkers policy did with respect to cars is it paid people to scrap their clunkers, to junk them. And the payment came in the form of a voucher that could be used to buy a new car. And so this policy was very successful, according to some metrics, in that it resulted in the scrappage of 700,000 vehicles. And the money for the program ran out in 3 months, after which $3 billion had been spent on these vouchers. Some people wonder whether the policy was actually effective in environmental terms. One of the questions was, did people junking a car, would they have done it anyway? Okay, so that was one of the issues. But anyway, so what we want to do here is look at a policy that would pay airlines to scrap rather than sell the planes that they are retiring from their fleet. So big airlines maybe fly a plane for 25 years and then they're done with it. And they either scrap it, there are a couple different ways to scrap, I'll explain that in a second, or they sell it to maybe a startup carrier who is desperate for cheap planes to, be profitable initially, or to airlines in developing countries who are happy to fly old planes. They don't, they can't afford new ones. And so the idea is to pay the airlines to scrap rather than sell their planes. Now, I should say that the scrappage involves either sending the plane to a junkyard where it's torn apart, for the materials in the plane, or else airlines sometimes will retain the plane and use it for spare parts. So suppose the airline's got a big fleet of planes and it's starting to retire that fleet. Sorry, a big fleet of a particular type of plane, and they're starting to retire that fleet. Over that period, they still have to operate the planes, and so having spare parts is important. And so the airline may keep its scrap planes that are not in service anymore, or its retired planes that are not in service anymore, and cannibalize them for spare parts. That's another scrappage method. Okay, and so why would this make sense? Well, it would essentially force the purchasers of these planes, the entities that would have bought them anyway, to use a newer plane in lieu of the one that they would have bought, and that plane would have lower emissions, okay? And so why is that? So the lower emissions can be seen from this picture here. Couple pictures. Here is the gallons per seat mile, which is a measure of fuel efficiency. In other words, how much fuel is used up per seat per mile flown. That's gallons per seat mile. This is gallons per seat mile by vintage for narrow body aircraft. And so you can see the vintage goes up, gallons per seat mile goes down. And so at the end here, we have the 737 MAX 9, a notorious plane, but it's very fuel efficient, right? And it's new. Over here, we've got a 727-100, which is, was built around 1960 and had terrible fuel efficiency. So there's been a lot of, a big reduction in fuel efficiency by aircraft vintage. And so if you make the guys trade one of these planes for one of these planes, you're going to get much less emissions generated. Okay, and here's the same picture for, sorry, this is a little slow, isn't it? This is the same picture for wide body planes. So here we have like 747-100, 1970, not such great fuel efficiency. Down here we've got the 787 Dreamliner-9, much lower fuel efficiency, but a brand new plane. The same true for these other ones here. And so the same goes for wide bodies. If we can get the airlines to junk their trash scrap their old wide body planes, they won't be used in an ongoing fashion by other carriers. So this is a vintage picture. Here's a graph that shows the average fuel efficiency of planes used by US carriers. So in other words, this is across the 6 US carriers that we focus on in the paper. Okay, so this is the average fuel efficiency of their planes weighted by number of aircraft of a given type. Okay, and so that's going down too. This is not a vintage picture, it's a different, but it offers the same message that average fuel efficiency is falling. Average gallons per seat mile is falling, so fuel efficiency is growing. Okay. All right, so there are a number of previous papers on sort of airlines and carbon emissions that some of them by me and co-authored with Christiana Abreu, who's sitting right there. And so these first two papers look at tax effects on fuel usage and emissions at an aggregate airline level. This paper, Fageda and Shado, looks at airline responses to the EU emissions trading system. So airlines were brought into the ETS system where companies have to pay for their carbon emissions by buying emission allowances. Airlines were brought into that system, and once that happened, there were various effects on the aircraft fleets used by European carriers. They had an incentive to get rid of their fuel inefficient planes. Okay, and then here is these papers here. One with me and the same co-authors look at operational responses to higher fuel prices. And one of those responses is slower flying. That when fuel prices are high, airlines fly their planes at slower speeds because just like cars, going fast burns more fuel. So if you slow down a little bit, you can save fuel. And when fuel is expensive, that's a good thing to do. Okay. All right, here's a model that says why the government might not think that the retirement and replacement decisions of airlines are optimal. And so just some definitions here. This is just one page of model. It's not going to go on. So F is the fuel price, C is emissions per gallon. The social cost of emissions are gamma. R is the discount rate, and M is the required maintenance on a plane at age A. So one thing that happens with planes is that in order to keep them at operational quality, maintenance has to go up a lot as they get older. So it's really expensive to do the maintenance on an old plane to keep it operating safely. Okay, and so here's the present value of the social cost of operation of these of this sequence of two planes. Okay, so F is the fuel usage of the first plane in the first vintage. F2 is the fuel usage of the plane in the second vintage. Then this is fuel price plus the social cost of carbon emissions times fuel usage plus maintenance cost. And then the same thing over here for the second plane. And so the transition date between the two planes is big T. And the airline is going to optimize by choice of that T when it switches from the fuel inefficient plane to the fuel efficient one. Now, why doesn't it just start using this plane right away? Well, maybe the plane is not available yet, but moreover, if it uses this plane right away, then by the end of its life, the maintenance costs are going to be astronomical. So it's better not to switch to the fuel efficient plane right away. Okay. So the moral of the story here is that the social planner thinks about C, the carbon emissions, the airline doesn't. And so what that means is that the airline is going to pick a bigger transition time, a bigger T than the social planner would. The airline's going to operate the old plane, the fuel inefficient plane longer than society would if it could decide the airline's decision. Okay, so that's pretty clear. Some journal referee said, "Oh, you don't need the model. You know, we understand that." But anyway, there's a lot of model hostility out there in among certain types of economists. All right. Okay, so here's an overview of the issues involved in trying to evaluate an airline cash-for-clunkers program. Just so everybody understands it, there isn't such a program now. We're proposing it, or we're investigating a possible program. Okay, so first question is, how big a payment does the government need to make to the airline in order to induce it to scrap rather than sell a retiring plane? The government's not going to order airlines to do this. It's going to pay them in order to make this scrappage decision. Okay, so how much does the government need to pay? Okay, that's a negative from the point of society. In other words, you're using taxpayer money to pay the airline to scrap its plane. But the other side of the issue is, what are the foregone carbon emissions from scrappage of the plane? Okay, and so you want to compare roughly those two things in deciding whether a scrappage policy would work. I mean, suppose you had to pay an airline a ton of money to scrap its plane, then the chances are that the gains from lower carbon emissions might be smaller, and so it's not worth doing it, right? So that's what we want to figure out. Is this program going to be feasible? Or is it going to be socially useful? Okay. Now, the cost per ton of foregone emissions from scrappage is what we can compute once we know the foregone emissions, okay? And then we can compare the cost per ton of foregone emissions to the social cost of carbon, okay? So depending on how big the social cost of carbon is, this program may or may not be useful. That's basically is a different way of saying what I just said about comparing these two things. Okay, and we know we have the various numbers that tell us what the social cost of carbon emissions is. Okay, so now what is this payment that we have to make to the airline? Well, the payment is equal to the difference between the airline's market price and its scrap value. Because the reason why the airline is selling the plane is because it can get more money for it by sale than by scrappage. And so we've got to pay the airline the difference between those two things. Okay? And in order to carry out this exercise, we need to know the market price of airplanes, of used airplanes. And so where is one going to get that? Well, it turns out that there are aircraft blue books, just like, you know, the blue books for used cars. There are aircraft blue books that tell you the selling price of a plane, of a model type, by year, by age. So we have a whole, you know, for each model type, you go for the different ages of that type, it'll tell you what the current market price of the plane is. So we got access to these aircraft blue books, which are ordinarily very expensive to buy, through the third co-author who has contacts. And so we know what the market prices are. So how are we going to get the scrap value? Totally unobserved. We don't know what it is. Okay. And so the scrap value can be estimated through a logit regression using data on the scrap versus sale decisions of retiring planes. You'll see how this works in a minute, okay? So we can run a logit regression to estimate the scrap value. And the explanatory variables in the logit regression are the market price of the plane and its characteristics. So here are the details on this logit procedure. So the plane scrap value is going to be x beta plus epsilon, where x is a vector of characteristics. What are the characteristics? The size of the plane, stuff like that, okay? And beta is a coefficient vector and epsilon is an error term. Okay? And let's let P denote the market value of the plane. Well, scrappage is going to occur when the scrap value, this thing, is bigger than the market price. Or in other words, when, well, wait. And so we can estimate beta using this relationship by a logit regression with the scrappage dummy as a dependent variable, 1 if scrap, 0 if sold, and minus P plus X beta on the right-hand side, okay? And so something that's unusual about this is that the coefficient on P has to be -1. It has to be constrained to be -1. You don't want a free coefficient on P. You want, because the theory says that the coefficient's -1. And so what you're estimating in the logit is beta, the coefficients on the characteristics, okay? And so, and to induce scrappage, you must pay the airline this amount, the difference between the market price and the scrap value, the estimated scrap value, where hat denotes the estimated beta, okay? But you only want to do this for planes that are likely to be sold. You don't want to be paying airlines to scrap planes that they were going to scrap anyway. That may have happened in the auto Cash-for-Clunkers program, okay? So how are we going to do this? We're going to use data on aircraft histories, which come from a public data set. It shows you the whole lifespan of planes by their registration number or their tail number. I've never actually fooled with these data. My co-authors did. Okay, so for all the planes in existence, you have this website tells you their histories. And so we're going to focus on retirements over the period 2015-2019, because those are the years for which we have price data. We don't have it for all years, just we have 3 blue books for 2015, 17, and 19. Okay? And we're going to look at these retirements for the 6 largest airlines and note their scrap sell decisions. Everybody's clear what the setup is? So here's the data set. I'm sorry. So there was more details here. So there are 565 aircraft retirements from the 6 largest airlines over this period. So pretty many retirements, right? They're getting rid of a lot of planes. I don't know how many of you are aviation buffs, but you probably know that one of the big retirement waves was for American Airlines. It operated a very large number of MD-80 type aircraft. There are a couple different MD-80 models. And so it basically retired all of those planes. It had several hundred of them, right? So that was a big retirement wave that occurred. And there were other retirement waves too. You'll see shortly. And so the characteristics are going to be in the logit regression are going to be seat capacity, age, and a variable called type count. So what is this? The type count is the number of planes of that type in the airline's fleet. So if type count is big, that means that the spare parts version of scrappage is possibly attractive to the airline. Okay, so the scrap value should go up when type count is high, because that means there are a lot of planes that will need parts before they retire, and you can use the scrap plane for those parts, okay? So under the second approach, capacity is dropped, and we just use aircraft type dummies. I mean, the aircraft type dummies tell you everything that you need to know about the plane, right? But they don't tell you what its age is, nor do they tell you what type count is. So those things stay in the logit regression. And so once we've done the logit, we're going to do calculations down the road that I'll explain to you that only focus on planes that are likely to be sold rather than scrapped. And so these planes have got a scrap probability of 0.5, less than 0.5, okay? And we do some sensitivity analysis on this number, but that says they're more likely to be sold than scrapped. Okay, so here's the data set for the, here's some summary statistics for this data set. Here are all the different planes that were retired. Here are these MD-80 version planes. Actually, many of them had been retired before 2015. So there were still some retirements here, but not the huge number that I was talking about. The most retired plane during this period was 757-200. And so that airplane is still popular with some airlines. If you've ever flown on Delta Airlines to Atlanta, you went on a 757-200. And so that plane is still operated by some carriers because it fits a niche in their needs. And one of the questions is, why hasn't Boeing designed a new version of the 757? And, you can go on TikTok and hear all kinds of discussion about this question. But anyway, so that was the most retired plane. And here's an unusual case, a 737-700. There was only one of those planes retired. What happened? Well, and that's a fairly new plane. So why are they retiring it? And so my co-author, who's a good sleuth, said, all right, this airplane was flown by Southwest, and it incurred nose wheel damage during a landing. And so they scrapped it. It wasn't sold. Or they kept it. And why did they keep it? Because their type count on this airplane is 400. They were flying 400 of those planes. Okay. All right, so let's go down let's look at the different scrappage things here. Scrappage is high for the 737-300, low for the 400. There are only 36 of those planes though. High for the 737-500. Then 747-400, most of them are scrapped. People just don't want to fly 747s anymore. But about 2/3 of the 757-200s were scrapped. 767, there were not that many of those. All of them were scrapped. 767-300 extended range, only 1/3 were scrapped. A320-200, about 2/3 were scrapped. Then almost all of the MD-82s were scrapped, and so on. Okay. And here are the market values of these planes. These are averages across the scrappage, the time period we're looking at. Here's the seat capacity. Here are the ages upon retirement. And you can see it's in the 20s. This 737-700 was only 18 years old. It was too young to be scrapped, but I told you why it got scrapped, and so on. And then here are the type counts. This is an average across all the airlines using that aircraft. Okay. So make sense? Market value varies a lot. If you want to buy an MD-82, you can get one for $1 million. The newer planes are a little bit more. If you want to buy a 747-400, it'll cost you $10 million. So So anyway,
A quick question.
Trump is flying these days.
it's a 757, probably 200. Yeah.
Question about the retired and type count. Are they both average?
Yeah, they're average. In other words, for all the planes, all the 737-300s that are being retired, for all across the different airlines that are doing it, this is the average age of those planes. And this is the type count averaged across the airlines that are retiring the 737-300. So on average, the airlines retiring those planes have 75 in their fleet.
But there might be a lot of variance in this.
Yeah. But anyway, this is just summary statistics, okay?
Why not we use the total count, total type count?
Because we're trying to look at individual airline retirement decisions, right? All right, so here's the logit regression. You can't see it, but because it's a long regression. But anyway, I'll tell you what the first column says. The first column is the one that uses aircraft capacity. And so we have a strongly positive coefficient on aircraft capacity measured in seats, okay? So bigger planes are more likely to be scrapped. So bigger planes are more likely to have a higher probability of being scrapped. And the type count is also positive. So in other words, scrappage is higher when the type count is high. And that matches up with predictions. So retirement age doesn't matter that much. And if you're a scrapper and you're buying a plane, you don't really care how old it is or how many miles it has on it, because you're going to tear it apart. So in a sense, it makes sense for that coefficient to be insignificant. Okay, so the correct prediction in this logit is 84%, which is pretty good, right? There's some time dummies here that don't matter. Now, the second regression is where we use aircraft type dummies and get rid of the capacity, which is, of course, perfectly correlated with those dummies, okay? And so, so now what happens is that both of those characteristics variables are insignificant. In other words, type count no longer matters once we put the plane dummies in. And I can't remember what the excluded one is, but all of these planes are less likely to be scrapped than the default type. Okay. Now this thing surprisingly has a better, or unsurprisingly has a better prediction rate, but not that much bigger. It's 87% rather than 84. Okay. All right, so now we can take the results of this regression and predict the clunkers payment. In other words, which is the market price minus the predicted scrap value. We can compute the clunkers payment for each plane. All right, so now what about the other side of the coin, which is estimating foregone emissions? So we have annual fuel usage by aircraft type and airline from the Bureau of Transportation's statistics T2 data set, along with carbon emissions per metric ton of fuel used. Okay, I mean, that's a number that's out there. You can get it, right? And again, we use 5,000 plus aircraft histories. I told you about those before, to estimate the lifespans for each type. So the lifespan is the number of years between when the plane was first put in use and when it was scrapped. Okay, so we can take the average lifespan for each type, and that's important, as you'll see in a minute. And then we can compute the remaining life for each retired plane using the age at retirement. So we know the lifespan and the age at retirement, so planes have got a particular number of years left. Okay. And so we can compute annual foregone emissions as the own emissions for the plane that's being scrapped, minus the lower emissions from a new plane of the same size and range. So there's some discretion involved in deciding what this replacement plane is going to be. It's not, most of the time, there's no leeway in making this choice, but sometimes it could be one or the other plane that you want to view as the replacement to the scrapped plane. And then we can get the annual foregone emissions this way, and we're going to compute the discounted value over the remaining life. So in other words, if the remaining life is long, then you're going to have bigger foregone emissions than if the remaining life is low. Okay. And now, all right. And then what we're going to do is we're going to divide the clunkers payment by the foregone emissions for each plane. And that's going to be the cost per ton of foregone emissions. Right? You'll see the numbers in a minute. And there's in economics, sometimes we do something which is adjusting by the cost of public funds. So the idea with the cost of public funds is that if the government raises a dollar in tax revenue, the taxes are distortionary. They disrupt the economy. And so we need to account for the distortion. So a dollar doesn't cost a dollar, it costs more than a dollar. And the number we use is 1.3, which is an accepted value, okay? And then what we're going to do is we're going to compare the cost per ton of foregone emissions to the official social cost of emissions, which is $51, according to the White House documents. But there are other costs per ton out there equal to $190. That's a new number from the EPA. Okay. So I'll mention if we use the higher value, what happens then. All right, so here's the table that shows the
Ask a question. So if the plane is sold, for example, to developing countries, would the social cost still be the same for the US?
Okay, let's come back to that at the end, okay? Because, what about these poor developing country airlines, right? We'll come back to that. Okay, so here's the table. This is the main table in the paper that's showing the results. And so, first of all, we're going to focus on the aircraft that are more likely to be sold than scrapped. So as it turns out, the airlines are scrapping most of their old planes. And so the ones that end up having a scrappage probability of less than a half, there's 65 of those planes. So those are the planes we're going to use for our calculations. And here they are. And here are the numbers of planes. So we've got 12 737-400s, 2 747-400s, 24 757-200s, 19 767-300ERs, and 8 A320-200s. Here are the market values again. Now here is the annual gallons of fuel that those planes use. Now there's one thing that's weird is the 737-400s are a little weird here because they seem to have not been used very much just prior to retirement. They weren't flying that much. And so we don't have a very big number here. And here's the remaining life on these planes. So the remaining life on the 757-200 was 5 years. And it was 10 years for the A320-200s. I think the airlines just stopped liking those A320. There were better Airbus planes that came along. And so they were scrapped. So the own emissions, this is the own annual, or is it annual or is it? Can't remember whether this is annual or discounted. Anyway, those are the emissions in metric tons over the remaining life of the plane. Okay. And here are the clunkers payments. This is how much you have to pay an airline to scrap these planes. So for 737-400, you got to pay it 1.2 million. For a 747-400, you got to pay it 3 million. For 757-200, you can get by with less than $1 million of a clunkers payment. For the A320-200s, you got to pay the airline a lot. You got to pay it $7 million to scrap that plane. Okay. Now, the thing is, remember that the own emissions and the clunkers payment, we don't want to make a comparison there. We want to compare the foregone emissions. And so the foregone emissions are gotten by multiplying the own emissions by one minus delta. Delta is the emissions of the new plane. Okay, so delta is less than 1. And so this is the number that we need to multiply own emissions by. This own emissions is the discounted value, I guess. It's not the annual level. It's a discounted value. And so for, what that means is the A320s are going to do 2.5, generate 2.5 discounted metric tons of emissions over their remaining life. That's the way to think about it. And so we're going to multiply the own emissions by 1 minus delta, and then we're going to divide the emissions reduction by the clunkers payment. Okay, we're going to divide the discounted foregone emissions by the clunkers payment, and we do it 2 ways. One with this cost of public funds adjustment. That's the second one. The first one is without. Okay, so look at the numbers in the first column there. They're pretty small. So we have cost per ton of $14 for the 737-400, of $7 for the 747, $1.60 for the 757s, and so on. A320-200 has the biggest one, partly because the clunkers payment is big. Okay, and so the punchline here is that all of those numbers are way below $51 per ton, which is the social cost of carbon, according to the White House. And so what that says is this program is a good deal for society. And it remains a good deal when you account for the distortionary effects of taxation. Essentially, these numbers here are these numbers multiplied by 1.3. Okay. Still, all those numbers are way below $51. Yeah.
I'm not sure if this is the right time to ask the question, but this assumes there's a market value for the plane, which means there's a buyer who wants to buy it. What is using your term, the distortion impact of taking that valuable commodity out of the market? What does the buyer do?
Okay, let's come back to that in a minute. Okay. Okay, so you see the story here? That from a pure calculation that looks at social cost of emissions and the cost per ton of foregone emissions from this program, the program looks very favorable. Okay. So let's do this on an aggregate basis. The numbers I just showed you were average values per aircraft, okay, of the different types. And so if we aggregate all this stuff up, we get that across the 65 target planes, aggregate foregone emissions are 25 million metric tons of carbon. Okay. Again, over the remaining lives of all these planes, and subtracting off the emissions from the new plane. The aggregate outlay on clunkers payments is $190 million. Okay, so the aggregate cost per ton of foregone emissions is then $764 with cost of public funds adjustment, and without it's 5.88. Okay. There's something called the marginal value of public funds used by environmental economists, and that's basically the benefit per ton divided by the cost per ton. And so the benefit here is 51. That's the value of the emissions, social cost of the emissions you're avoiding, and then this is the cost. That's 8.67. So that's a big number. So economists think, all right, if that number is bigger than 1, then the policy is good. Okay, so here's something that's called a McKinsey curve, which environmental economists like. This thing gives you the the marginal cost of foregone emissions as a function of the amount of emissions you're foregoing. And so the way you get this curve is you take the numbers from the table, and then you note how many planes of a given type there are. And that number and the emissions they create gives you the length of the horizontal segments here. So you could get up to 120 million tons of foregone emissions from the 757-200s. But then if you want more, you're going to go up to a higher cost per ton of foregone emissions. If you want even more, you're going to go higher, and then so on up the staircase. And so ordinarily what the environmental economists would do is they would draw a horizontal line at the height of the social cost of carbon, and where the line intersects, they would say, oh, that's where you want to stop. No more emissions reduction beyond this point. But our horizontal line is off the chart. It never intersects this McKinsey curve. Okay, so you want to pay for scrappage of all of these planes. Okay. So what are our robustness checks? We use planes with scrappage probability 0.25 instead of 0.5. This reduces the chances of the payment being made for a plane that would have been scrapped anyway. So the environmental economists have sort of a weird term for this. They call it additionality. In other words, additionality is satisfied when the payment is making something happen that wouldn't have happened otherwise, right? And so people might be worried that if we use a 0.5, we're going to violate additionality for lots of these planes. They would have been scrapped anyway, even though we're paying for it, okay? So this robustness check helps. And so we get the set of targeted planes shrinks to 43. But the main conclusions still hold. Other checks are assuming 60% versus 100% post-retirement utilization of the planes. So in other words, the calculations assume that utilization is going to be the same post-sale for planes as it was before the sale to the new party. But oftentimes that's not true. If you're selling a plane to an overseas airline in a less developing country, it's not like the United States where the flights are going back and forth all day long. They may fly less, okay? Another thing is the plane might be used for cargo flights, which are less frequent. All right, so that adjustment doesn't affect the conclusions, and it's no surprise because there's such a big gap between $51 and our cost per ton. And then the discount rate, changing the discount rate from 7% to 7% from 5% doesn't matter either. So this, the story is pretty robust to these types of adjustments. Okay, so here's the conclusion, and I'm going to now address at the end the comments that have been made here. So airlines can be induced to scrap rather than sell their retiring planes at a cost that is worth incurring. That's the message of the paper. Okay, And we get this aggregate cost per ton of 7.6. Now, how would this actually work in practice? Here's our view of how it would work. Each year, the government would ask each airline which planes it is planning to retire next year. And the government say, don't tell us what you're going to do with them when they're retired. Just tell us which ones are going to be retired. Okay. And then the government would run its logit regression using maybe more data than we've got. And it would figure out what the clunkers payments, it would figure out which planes are likely to be sold rather than scrapped. And it would figure out what the clunkers payments for these planes are. And then the government would say, okay, we will pay you to scrap rather than sell the following list of planes you're planning to retire. And here are the numbers we'll pay. So that's how it would work in practice. Okay. And of course, it would only make that payment if the cost per ton stuff works out. Okay, now let's talk about a few issues here. One issue is, suppose this program were in operation everywhere in the world. Then the supply of used planes would go down. And their prices would go up. And that is going to affect the clunkers payments. And so the prices and the program and the market prices that are used are kind of intertwined with one another. Now, if just the United States did the program, there would be a smaller effect on used plane supply. And so anyway, that's an issue here. But just, what we're trying to do is show that this is conceptually a sound idea, and there are all kinds of wrinkles, and that's one of them. Now, the other problem is these developing country airlines. So essentially what we're going to tell the developing country airlines, assuming this program can be done everywhere, is that, sorry, guys, you can't fly these crappy old planes anymore. They're gone. We're paying the airlines to scrap them. And so you've got to get yourself a newer plane with greater fuel efficiency. And so but those planes are more expensive. And so what we're saying is that, sorry, I mean, now it's your problem what to do with this state of affairs. It's not our problem. And the logic for that would be that, look, it's environmentally inefficient for these old planes to be flying. So we should get rid of them. If that hurts developing country airlines, then, I mean, that's an issue that maybe needs to be dealt with by the governments of those countries. Maybe they need to subsidize aircraft purchases for their airlines. Some of those carriers are public anyway, right? But the ones that are private, they perhaps need to be subsidized for the purchase of these newer planes that they must buy, given the absence of used planes. That's the right solution. The right solution is not to help out the developing country airlines by allowing them to fly planes that are environmentally inappropriate. So that's the logic. If we want to fix the harm done to the buyers who are being denied access to these planes, we need to use other methods to do it, not give them access to these planes that shouldn't be flying. All right. So let me just add one last statement here. So some of you guys may know that Raquel Gervin, who was one of the early PhDs from ITS in the transportation science program, she was my student. She sort of did an economics type PhD, and she's a very good student. Anyway, she got a job at the FAA, and commensurate with her high ability level, she's now the Western Regional Director for the FAA. And I had some discussions with her about some other issues by email. I hadn't seen her in a long time. But after those discussions, I said, you know, I'm going to send her our Cash-for-Clunkers paper. And I'm going to say, look, here's a program that we think is feasible. Why don't you think about implementing it? Haven't heard back from her. But who knows? Maybe the thing is going up the channels or something. All right. Yeah.
Just why are you assuming that you have to fund this by, let's say, general tax revenues? Because if the problem is that the airlines are not accounting for the
Right.
full social cost of carbon, why don't you just put a aviation fuel tax on? That's gonna be that, that will may get you to the first best solution
Right.
anyway,
Okay.
and would not generate this extra 1.3, hit. Right.
And so the answer to that question is that you're right. Remember the optimization problem that we had there about choosing the point from switching from the old to the new plane? If we impose a carbon tax on airlines, would raise the fuel price. Carbon tax equal to the emissions damage from the fuel. Then the switch point of the airline from the old to new plane would be the same as the one that the social planner would pick. So carbon tax is going to fix this problem. The carbon tax will fix all environmental problems to a great extent. But in the United States, we can't levy a carbon tax because various groups are opposed to such a thing, even though it's the right approach. So carbon tax will get rid of this issue.
But we don't need a full carbon tax. All you need is an aviation fuel tax. And so, the constituency, the problem with putting a carbon tax in the economy is that's essentially a price on gasoline. And we all know if gasoline prices go up, no politician want to get elected, but aviation fuel is special.
Okay. So, yes. And in fact, Christiane and I, in our paper from a while, in 2017, I believe it was, what we did is we ran regressions relating airline fuel usage at the aggregate level, the aggregate airline level, over time for a whole sample of airlines to a whole bunch of things. And one of them was the fuel price. And so the fuel price coefficient would tell us if you put on a fuel tax, what the effect on fuel usage would be. And the answer is the fuel usage will go down because fuel usage is lower when the price is high. And so we found that if you put an environmentally optimal fuel tax on airlines, and the fuel tax is 39 cents per gallon, then fuel usage by the airlines will go down by 2%. But this was a kind of short run thing. It sort of held the airline fleets constant. It didn't account for fleet adjustments like we're talking about here. But anyway, yeah, you're right. I suppose we should really say that in the paper, I think. I think it's a good comment. Nobody else? Yeah.
Yeah, I have a quick question with regard to your table about the type count and the retirement amount. Why retirement amount we use the total amount?
The retirement age?
Retirement planes, the second column number of planes.
This is a per plane. This is all on a per plane basis. All these numbers are per plane.
Per plane.
And then when we add them up across the planes, we get the aggregate numbers I just told you. So we multiply the number, we multiply 12 by those numbers and so on and so forth and add them up. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, would you mind go back to the next, the previous table that you show? Just this one. The number of retired, are they the total amount of retired planes?
Yeah. Over this period.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, because the second column is the total number of retired, but the last column, the type count is the average.
Yeah.
Is it okay?
No, it's fine. This is not this is not an average. These are all averages. They're averages across the planes in this 565 retirement sample. And so maybe the type count is not right because we ought to have the type count. We're sort of averaging this type count over and over again across a given airline, when maybe we should take a different approach to computing the mean of type count. But anyway, that's a small issue. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it makes sense. Another question is about the McKenzie curve. I'm wondering, since it starts with the lowest marginal
Right.
benefit, I'm wondering if we purchase them back, shall we start with the highest marginal?
Well,
The more,
wait, but I mean, don't we want to get emissions reduction at the lowest cost?
Mhm.
This is marginal cost of emissions reduction. It's not benefit. The benefit is the $51, which is not in the picture, right? So we always want to retire the planes first that have the lowest marginal cost.
Mm.
Okay.
Which means the highest marginal benefit.
No, it doesn't. The benefit is the marginal cost it's the cost per ton of emissions. The benefit is the social cost per ton of emissions. In other words, the environmental gain from getting rid of 1 ton of emissions. Make sense?
Yeah, I kind of got it. So
Anyway, this paper's on my website if you want to read it. All the gory details are there.
got it. Thank you.
I wanted to just clarify the question I asked earlier. I wasn't as much being empathetic for the position of the buyers of these used planes.
Mhm.
But I'm just kind of wondering from a practical matter, I was thinking, okay, what happens? So they don't have this plane to buy, right? Do they go out of business? Do they continue flying their plane that's even worse than the one that they were?
I don't know. I guess they keep flying that plane. And so, that's sort of beyond the scope of the
I
paper.
understand, and I'm just curious. You know much more about this than I would, and if you had
Yeah.
a feel for what they.
I don't know. I think the answer is yes, they continue flying their old plane. And so do we need to consider that as well? I don't know. You can go on and on and on with these things. There's another point we mentioned in the paper that is, well, look, if you're gonna get rid of a whole bunch of used planes, then you need to make more new ones. And so there's an environmental cost to doing that, and we should consider it. But again, beyond the scope. Yeah.
What happens? So I guess I know you're looking at like a very short time frame, 2015 to 2019. I would say that the years following that would probably create a significant structural break in the model.
Yeah, for sure. And so that's why we didn't use them. Or we didn't ask. We asked for the blue books we asked for 3 blue books pre-pandemic.
Right. Yeah. So I'm wondering how this type of program would fare under different industry outlooks, right? Because
Right.
this was a time during significant growth in the airline industry. If you look probably 2019 to 2022, not so great, and then you see a lot of growth in 2023, and then this year was pretty much a cool down for the industry.
But for example, I bet if we got a blue book for 2020, it would show a collapse in used airplane prices.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But again, they probably wouldn't even know how to get the prices because there would be no transactions in used planes, because the airlines the traffic had collapsed.
Well, the other thing the airlines did is they mothball them.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a third option you didn't.
Right. Well, that's the thing, it's funny. My co-author, Jerry Nicholsberg, before he's an adjunct professor at UCLA, he runs the Anderson Forecast Center in the business school. And before he got his PhD, he worked for an airline leasing company. And so he knows a lot about this stuff. And he said, the planes in the desert are not scrapped because they may be reused. Yeah. They may be taken back. So that's a category like storage or something that's neither scrappage nor sale. I realized that in writing this paper, I didn't know the answer to that question. I thought, why haven't I learned the answer? But that's the answer. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that somebody told about the developing countries,
Yeah.
and I think that in Brazil, the age of the planes they are newer from if we compare with US.
Yeah, that's
So
true.
sometimes we have to take care or when we are talking about the developing countries, because it's not all developing.
No, you're right. You're right. But so Christiane and I are doing some new work with a really incredible Brazilian data set that we came across that's actually been used by other researchers. We didn't understand it, but there are very few old planes in the Brazilian fleet.
Yeah.
There are no MD-80s. There are hardly any really old 737s there. So the planes are pretty new.
Yeah.
It's quite noteworthy. All right. Thanks for coming.
May I ask,
Oh, yeah.
may I ask a small question about the papers? Professor, we saw you're a senior professor, but in your papers, you're always still in the first author. But it's contrary to some other fields, if they are kind of old professor, they move to the back.
Yeah, well, the thing is that I have some papers where I'm a small contributor, and my name on those papers goes at the end. So I don't know what the ITS habit here is, but if I'm a big contributor to the paper, my name and the names are alphabetical.
Yeah, the default in economics is been alphabetical for many years. In some big, like developing, some big development economics projects, or there are many co-authors, then they revert to the STEM view where the last author got the money and the first author did the work, and everybody in between, who knows? So, yeah.
But I mean, I have written very few papers where I'm not a major or the major person doing the paper. So if that wasn't true, I wouldn't put my name first.
But Jan and I get listed first a lot because our last names begin with B,
Right,
so that's all there is to it.
Right.
Well, thank you. On behalf of ITS Irvine, everyone in this room, our virtual audience, I'd like to thank you, Dr. Brueckner, so much for your really
My pleasure.
interesting presentation. Like to wish you, all the students in the room, best of luck in your upcoming finals, a wonderful holiday season. Encourage everyone to consider TRB in January, and